A sharp escalation in fighting in eastern Ukraine and reports of a Russian troop buildup at the border. It could signal an end to another ceasefire in the region. So, what next for a conflict now in its 8th year? Is there any chance of a lasting peace? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Efforts to resolve the 7-year war in eastern Ukraine have all so far failed. There have been ceasefires and then, almost inevitably, violations of ceasefires. But a major flare-up in fighting between Russian-backed separatists and Ukrainian troops is now threatening to escalate the conflict beyond anything we've seen so far. Russia is reportedly massing its troops at the border and warning NATO not to send military support to Ukraine. But the alliance and the United States have made it clear Kiev will not be left alone if Russia launches an offensive in the region. We'll discuss this with our guest shortly, but first, Nadim Baba reports.
It's pictures like this that have got the government in Kiev so concerned. A week ago, 4 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in fighting in the east. Now Kiev's accusing Russia of preparing to expand its military presence in the separatist-controlled regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as the border with Crimea to the south.
Москва має припинити військове нагнітання.
On Thursday, Ukraine's foreign minister called on Moscow to, quote, immediately and unconditionally reaffirm its commitment to a political and diplomatic settlement and a ceasefire regime. Now President Joe Biden has spoken directly with the Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky. The White House says he affirmed the United States' unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's ongoing aggression.
We discussed the situation in Donbass in detail. President Biden assured us that Ukraine will never be left alone against Russia's aggression.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says any new conflict in the east would, quote, destroy Ukraine. He's warned against incitement by Western powers. With the NATO defense alliance saying it's concerned about a Russian build-up, Moscow says the real threat is NATO sending troops to Ukraine.
Undoubtedly, such a scenario would lead to a further increase of tension near the Russian border. Of course, this will require additional security measures from the Russian side.
In February 2014, the so-called Maidan revolution saw Ukraine's Russia-friendly president Viktor Yanukovych deposed and the opposition take power. The next month, Russian forces annexed Crimea from Ukraine, prompting Western sanctions. In April 2014, pro-Russian separatists seized part of the eastern Donbass region, starting the internal military conflict in Ukraine. In 2019, television actor Vladimir Zelensky was elected Ukraine's president. He and President Putin agreed to exchange prisoners and commit to a ceasefire. Last July, a ceasefire with Donetsk separatists was agreed, but it's close to breaking. And now the Ukrainian leaders provoked Russian anger.
He went after the pro-Russia media empire belonging to one of Vladimir Putin's confidants in Ukraine, closing down 3 pro-Russian TV channels and severely weakening the influence of pro-Russian narrative in Ukraine. And keep in mind, Putin's overarching goal has always been to to put these puppet regimes in the Donetsk and Luhansk back into Ukraine.
Despite the latest warnings, it's not clear whether there's been a real change. The Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe says there are far fewer ceasefire violations than last summer, before the agreement came into force. Nadim Baba, Al Jazeera.
All right, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, a defense analyst and columnist for Novaya Gazeta. In Kiev, Olexiy Haran, a professor of comparative politics at Kiev Mohyla Academy. And in Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, a security analyst at the strategic consultancy Wikistrat. Welcome to you all. Pavel, let me start with you today. From your vantage point, does it look like this situation is going to escalate, and how likely or unlikely is it that this is going to boil into actual conflict?
Well, for already a month or so, There has been a lot of talk in the Russian press about the situation in the Donbass getting worse, about an escalation, that there may be a big war. And everyone understands that it's right now, of course, impossible. So that there's some shootings happening there, maybe not so big, actually, clashes, some skirmishes in the Donbass. They're a bit overplayed by the press. But in the future, somewhere, everyone is talking right now about the beginning of May, there can be a big confrontation, a major escalation of the hostilities in the entire region. Because right now, of course, the snow is just melting still in Russia and in Ukraine. The fields are a sea of dirt. It's called Rasputitsa. That means maneuverable warfare is basically impossible. But by May, it should dry up, and then everyone apparently is going to be ready. And there's lots of talk that Ukraine is going to attack, that Russia is going to get involved, that the West is going to get involved, and a lot of scarce stories around here in Moscow.
Oleksiy, how worried are people in Ukraine right now, and how worried is the government?
We are all very worried. In general, I agree with Pavel's analysis, whom I really respect. And my question to Pavel, do you believe that Ukraine is going to attack? Frankly speaking, no, I believe not. Because that's what we hear from Kremlin. It's not in our interest to have a mass confrontation. What we see now in the Donbass, well, Pavel called it skirmishes, but let me remind you that officially what we have right now is a full, total ceasefire. And nevertheless, there is an aggravation, and since the beginning of this year, 30 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. So that's the problem that we don't have ceasefire. Actually, the ceasefire was promised in September 2014, but since then there was no real ceasefire. So, and what Putin is doing right now, he's definitely trying to test the West, to test the newly elected president of the United States. And also, he's going to test Ukrainian government as well. And I believe that we will have possibility to talk about this in a minute.
Richard, if you could expand on something that Oleksiy was saying just there. He said that he believes that this is essentially a test by Russia's President Vladimir Putin to see how far he can go when it comes to Joe Biden and see what kind of reaction he can elicit from the Biden administration. What are your thoughts on that? And also, just how concerned is the U.S. about all this right now?
Sure. The thinking here is this is a concern, but there's not an expectation of an imminent Russian military attack on Ukraine. The factors that appear to be driving the recent war scare are several. At home, we know President Putin's popularity is under strain. There's been a lot of focus on the protests. And so having a war scare can be useful for distracting people's attention. As in Ukraine, we've seen the government there take some firm steps recently against Russian influence, reining in some of the Russian media. President Zelensky has proven tougher than I think the Russians anticipated. And as was mentioned, possibly this is an effort to test the new Biden administration. We know that other countries are doing this, North Korea with its missile tests and so on. And, you know, Biden has a record with Ukraine of strongly supporting the government, but the U.S., of course, is just distracted by a bunch of challenges at home and abroad. So maybe the Russians are probing the depth of the U.S. commitment. And I would also add in the European and transatlantic dimensions. I think there were some talks between the presidents of Russia and the heads of Germany and France, and maybe the Russians think they see an opening to try and exploit differences between the allies. So I think all these factors may at work. But again, there's not expectation of imminent military action, particularly since the U.S. took a very firm stand. It had President Biden for the first time call the president of Ukraine. We've also had exchanges of phone calls between other senior U.S. and Ukrainian leaders.
Pavel, you heard Richard there talk about the fact that President Putin has been bristling from these anti-government demonstrations that happened in January over the treatment of Oleksiy Navalny. You know, there are some who say that the timing of this may be more than just coincidental. You have also Putin coming under criticism for his response to the coronavirus. You also have Russian parliamentary elections that are scheduled to happen in September. Could all this be chalked up to President Putin trying to re-energize his base?
Well, to some extent, yes, but it's a bit more complicated. The Kremlin, Putin believes that the West is right now began war against Russia. Hybrid wars are being waged against Russia and personally against him to delegitimize his regime. That Navalny was specifically landed in January to raise havoc here in Russia. The economic situation is not very nice. The household incomes have been decreasing for almost 10 years, slowly but steadily, and up now. So in 10 years, they decreased about 15%. That's the real income of households in Russia. And that's bad for any political regime in any country. That's a big danger. And so Putin believes that the West, the Russian elite believes that the West is actually fighting them and that Russia should push back. Relations with the United States are not simply bad, they're very bad. Biden called Putin a killer. That means he wants him out. That means the West wants a regime change. Relations with the European Union are said to be zero. So in a situation when the political level of relations is almost zero, the Russian ambassador was recalled from Washington. That never happened during the Cold War, and he's still in Moscow. That's almost a pre-war situation or something close to it. So in such a position, Moscow maybe would believe, the Kremlin would believe, it's time to push the front line in the Donbass away from Crimea, say.
Oleksiy, let me ask you this. Sorry, Pavel. We paused there for a second. Let me go ahead and jump to Oleksiy and ask him a quick follow-up question. You know, there are Ukrainian officials who have urged de-escalation. What are the steps that need to be taken in order to de-escalate this situation right now?
Well, first of all, I think that's easy to keep the ceasefire. You know, what we have in the Donbass, we have Moscow's proxies. They are not independent. They are controlled by Moscow. So, and all the history of the conflict in Donbass shows that when Putin would like to, is going to decrease escalation, he can easily do that. But again, there are reasons now, and we have discussed it, that Putin decided to escalate. So the order from Kremlin would be the first and the most important steps for the ceasefire. And then there are other things which could be, and actually that are on the ground, you know, withdrawal of troops, some other things. Again, this full ceasefire, which was called in summer last year, it included a lot of measures in order to enforce the ceasefire. But unfortunately, there is not ceasefire. Regarding phobias of Mr. Putin, we had a joke that Mr. Navalny poisoned himself in order to overthrow Putin's regime, to create background for accusing Mr. Putin. And regarding whether the large-scale war may happen, I would agree here with military and political analysis by Pavel. But we should remember that in 2014, very few people could predict that Russian regular forces would appear in the Donbass, that Russians would kill Ukrainians. Very few people actually predicted that Russia would annex Crimea. So at that time, if you asked me, I'm Ukrainian, fluently speaking Russian. So if you asked me, do I believe that Russian soldiers would appear in Ukraine, killing Ukrainians, I would say no. Maybe I am a bad analyst, but many people would say no, it's impossible. And unfortunately, it happened. So dealing with Russia, yes, there is some, rational thinking which says us that no, it's not going to be a large-scale military operation, but you're never sure.
Richard, the Biden administration has been working hard to rebuild alliances with NATO countries in the wake of all the chaos of the Trump years. Are those allies now feeling confident that the U.S. will stand with them when it comes to any potential confrontations with Russia?
I think so. I mean, the question's a bit broader than that, in that there's been some concern that the allies themselves are a bit divided over Russia. You've got some NATO partners that want to take a very firm stand, and others that want a more cooperative approach. And you're seeing this particularly in the case of the Nord Stream pipeline debate within the alliance. So yes, part of the U.S. effort has been to reaffirm U.S. ties to the alliance, which I would argue were strong even in the Trump administration, but they've taken steps to reinforce that. But also you're still seeing disputes over the question of the pipeline, perhaps NATO spending. They had some recent meetings lately. But on the question of Ukraine, the alliances and the Europeans and the Americans have stood very firm. So I would not have expected the EU, for example, to keep on rolling over its extensive sanctions, since it would just take one EU state to block them against Russia for its actions in Ukraine. But we've got a fairly extensive network of U.S., European, both NATO and non-NATO member sanctions on Russia. So I think on the Ukraine question, there's been pretty strong solidarity that Russia needs to roll back its ambitions in Ukraine, restore territorial integrity of the country, stop interference in internal affairs, and so on.
Pavel, from your vantage point, is there any hope that peace talks could get back on track anytime soon?
Well, the official peace talks, the three-side talks in the Minsk, so-called Minsk framework, they're right now totally deadlocked. Everyone agrees on that nothing's happening there, that people are just sort of stating positions that are not complying to each other. I mean, they meet to have some talks, but nothing's happening. Total deadlock. There are attempts by European countries, France and Germany, to try to move something forward, find some kind of way to defuse the situation, which is getting a lot of people in Europe really scared. I have had contacts with top European diplomats who wanted to know my opinion on what's happening, because they're scared in Brussels. Right now, they have ambassadors to NATO, ambassadors to European Union, sitting down there trying to figure out what to do, how to respond. Are the Russians really ready to go, or it's just a lot of hot air? I would believe, basically, that Putin, his 20 years, record shows that he's not basically a conqueror much. I believe that he mostly would want to horse trade, but to horse trade from a position of strength and maybe improve the situation on the ground a bit. No one, of course, right now, on either side, East or West, wants this to develop into a big regional war and all European conflict. Though the potential of that, it's not zero. It does exist. And troops are being moved forward. Russia's not denying that it moved troops to the Ukrainian border. The Kremlin announced that we have the right to move our troops inside Russia where we wish. And 3 Russian major assault vessels from the Baltic Sea on the 21st of March steamed through the channel, as the British report, going south, apparently maybe to the Black Sea. Maybe there's a major landing assault operation being planned, or the potential to do such a thing. So the threats are growing, and the diplomacy is lagging, and that's a very bad situation.
Olexiy, it's been over 6 years since the Minsk II agreement was signed. Were the terms of that agreement ever implemented properly?
The short answer is no. Again, there were some attempts to implement at least part of Minsk agreements, basically the ceasefire. And from time to time, we have established ceasefire, but then it goes to escalation again. Let me remind you that after President Zelensky was elected, he used very, very peaceful rhetoric. Zelensky was a very inexperienced in politics and a bit, I would say, naive in politics. And he said it's just necessary to sit down. This is his famous phrase. I need to sit down with Putin to see into each eyes, and then we'll discuss what do you want, what can we do, and we will do something. And after that, after Zelensky's election, he made very important and symbolic concessions to Putin, which in the eyes of Ukrainian opposition were very, very bad. So Zelensky did it. So he made concessions to Putin. But at the end of the day, you know, he didn't receive what he wanted, full ceasefire. And basically, this is one of the reasons why Zelensky decided to close down 3 pro-Russian channels in Ukraine. And these channels have nothing to do with freedom of speech. They're just, you know, example of hybrid war, which Pavel mentioned. And we call it hybrid war because Russia is doing it not only on the front line, but also within Ukraine, within other countries, trying to destabilize the situation.
Richard, let me ask you, actually, this is a two-part question. The first is, what is the level of commitment of the Biden administration toward Ukraine? And the second thing is, do you think we could see a Minsk III agreement anytime soon?
I would say first, the level of U.S. commitment to Ukraine under Biden is very strong. They're going to continue the decision of the Trump administration to build up and supply the Ukrainian military with defensive weapons and training. There's extensive diplomatic support. There was some questioning over the past month why President Biden didn't call President Zelensky, but I think, you know, in the series of phone calls last few days have solved that question. And in terms of, let's see, what was the second question again?
Do you think that we could see a Minsk III agreement anytime soon?
Well, I mean, the problem with the Minsk structure is you don't have all the important players, particularly the United States. So, I mean, the British, the French, and the Russians and Ukrainians can go so far, but it could be useful to have to widen the format to allow for a wider range of possible trade-offs discussions. Right now, the U.S. can't join Minsk because it would require the consent of all the parties, and the Russians would object. But a new format, there are other structures that work as well. The OSCE is working through a trilateral format with the Russians and the Ukrainians. I think it's less so a problem of mechanism and format, and more a problem that there's just not an agreement on the ends, whatever they say in paper. I think that the current Russian government likes the present situation, where it can dial up and dial down tensions regarding Ukraine for tactical advantage. And I don't see that anything fundamentally changing in Russian policy as long as the current government is in power there.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Pavel Felgenhauer, Olexiy Haran, and Richard Weitz. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.